Welcome to Nuked Radio and the long-awaited Wigner Effect interview with Leuren Murray. This program will cover the basics of the Fukushima accident and how radioactive fallout affects components related to airlines and infrastructure. We will present a list of compelling evidence that we believe shows a correlation to recent accidents and emergencies in the aviation industry. A more detailed list, explanation, and historic data will be published on the internet following this interview. It is our hope that Fukushima researchers, radiation experts, material science specialists, engineers, pilots, flight crews, and aviation mechanics will find this information interesting and help add to this growing body of evidence with their own observations and discussions. Dr. Leuren Murray is an atmospheric fallout expert and has interviewed extensively about the Fukushima accident and its effects on the health of downwinders, marine life, and mutations in plants, animals, and people. She is a depleted uranium expert and appeared in the documentary Beyond Treason with former U.S. Army radiation health specialist Dr. Douglas Roque. She was a special guest lecturer for the Malaysian War Crimes Tribunal. She has appeared several times on True TV's Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura in regards to the Great Lakes water supply and the health issues surrounding the use of TSA scanners. She has done over 20 speaking tours in Japan and has lectured extensively about the dangers of nuclear power worldwide, even prior to the Fukushima accident. She has worked at both Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos nuclear weapons labs as a geoscientist and on both the waste isolation pilot plant and the Yucca Mountain nuclear storage facility prior to becoming a whistleblower. This brief introduction does not do justice to her enormous contributions that she has made, and it is an honor and privilege to work with her again. We will also be joined today by Laurence Batiste. Leuren, would you like to introduce Laurence?
Yes. Laurence Batiste is an engineer and a journalist. He's from a long line of engineers. He has attended Northeastern University, DINFOS, which is the Defense Information School, when he was in the Navy for 5 years, and CSUN, the California State University Northridge, where he got a film degree. He is a practicing engineer, the publisher and editor of LMGNC. It's Leuren Murray at Google.
A global nuclear cover-up. We are at leurenmurray.info and on G+ at LM:GNC. Hi, I'm Larry.
This is Larry. Laurence.
Lawrence.
And yes, we both have the same name.
We do.
Mine is the French pronunciation, Leuren, and his is the Dutch pronunciation,
Laurence.
Thank you.
We would also like to thank Alfred Weber, Rob Soltysik, Heather Stewart, Linda Menzies, Stephen Moyer, Moana Nalu, Al Jacklick, Kevin Blanche, Austin Martin, T.A. Raven Flight, Tico Turner, and Janet Saxon Payek for helping us collect these numerous events that we're going to be talking about today. For without their contributions, an interview this extensive would not be possible. Leuren and Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
We're really happy to be on, and a very special thanks to the contributors you just mentioned, because without the citizens' contributions and participation in our research, we wouldn't have nearly as much information to present today. So thank all of you.
Everyone has a piece of the puzzle. It's
Yes.
time for us to start putting them together and solving this puzzle.
And thank you, Christina.
Well, you're welcome. We're going to be talking about some events that we've been following since about the end of February. And at that time, I was working on other aviation type problems related to radiation in the skies with pilots passing out. And it was a few weeks after I had done an extensive interview with Alfred Weber on exopolitics that we had the disappearance of Flight 370. And I know, Leuren, you have interviewed extensively on what happened to Flight 370, as well as MH17. And for people who may want more information about both of those plane disappearances and a plane crash, where can they find that information?
That's on LeurenMurray.info, and if you go to the bottom of the home page, you will find them listed. Click on the link and it takes you to the story. And Flight 370, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 that crashed in early March, and actually it was shot down by the U.S. Navy, and it crashed in Singapore airspace, which gave MI6 and the CIA control over the investigation, so they covered it up. And the Flight 17, which was also a missile attack on a commercial airline, these were both described in Project Northwoods, and that was thought up, dreamed up in the 60s or 70s by the Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon, if you can believe that. And they are the bookends of Obama's pivot to Asia.
Yeah, in fact, that was the late 50s, early 60s that they started floating these ideas, the object being to false flag utilizing civilian aircraft. The object of that being to pin the blame on your opponent, therefore freeing you to act against them because public opinion is following your lead, which is the definition of a false flag.
Well, I've seen both of those interviews that you did, Leuren, and they are absolutely stunning. In fact, the Flight 370 interview, I think I've watched 3 times. I mean, it was really amazing. I learned so much just from that one incident.
There was a lot to learn, believe me. I've never covered anything like that before, and it's just absolutely mesmerizing. You can't believe it's happening. You can't believe it was deliberately done, and by the Navy both times. Well, believe it, because they conceived that program.
The incidents that we're going to be talking about today break down into the following plane problems, and Leuren and I had started really closely paying attention to this around the 3-year anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. And we both have done extensive interviews on that disaster and health effects and the effects on the ocean, and there's some excellent articles that Leuren has up on her website about that go into more detail, and we're learning more all the time. But what we're going to talk about today is specifically what evidence that we may have that may correlate to metal fatigue and other structural abnormalities happening to planes that are flying through radioactive air. And I kept kind of a running tab just on all the different incidents, and this was the breakdown when I went through and updated this list today. Windshields cracking or falling off the cockpit. Cross tubes breaking on helicopters when they land. Oil pressure drops. In fact, we've had 3 of those, I think, in the last 3 days. Melting batteries.
Very
Hydraulic
common.
faults. Panels falling off planes. Failures of tail rotors on helicopters. Electrical generator failures. Issues with nose gear or landing gear. Small planes crashing after pilots are passing out or just never reaching their destination. I think we've had 3 or 4 of those just in the last week. small planes that are going into a dead spin and crashing without even contacting flight control or having a squawk emergency, engines catching fire, engines failing, explosions or loud noises, strange smells and smoke, forcing emergency landings, failure of fluid power systems, cabin depressurization. I've had a couple of those in the last few days, de-icing systems that are kicking on mid-flight, metal particles that are being found in failed engine filters,
Oh,
loud bangs and flames that are happening in otherwise operating engines, helicopters and small planes that are experiencing catastrophic losses of power, wings that are partially detaching from planes. Believe it or not, we actually have video of that. Malfunctioning onboard computers, and a few less rare but still newsworthy incidents: deployment of emergency slides inside planes during flight, and water pipes breaking,
yeah.
flooding planes during flight.
Yeah.
Those are just, that's a sample of what we're going to be talking about tonight, based on the events that we have collected since the 3rd year anniversary of the Fukushima disaster. So we'd like to start with some basic information, and we have 10 talking points that we've put together to kind of break down and lay out the research that we've been doing for the last 7.5 months. Larry, would you like to start with the talking points?
Well, what we're looking at is indicators. And if you think of it in those terms, then the real overlying thing that we're looking for is entropy and rates of entropy. Entropy being the inevitable breakdown of compounds. It's quite natural. Rust is a demonstration of it. So the next thing you look for an indicator is the speed at which it's occurring. Now, I recall vividly when you and Leuren were having a discussion one evening. I was working on some video, I believe, at the time. And the conversation came around to the number of unusual aircraft incidences that were occurring. And I just kind of piped in, well, radiation, it does crystallize metal. And we've been off to the races ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Wigner has become one of the major indicators, and the reason why is because it is universal. It doesn't just affect metal. It affects everything.
Including
Metal.
humans.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Including us. So when we're watching for rates of entropy, we can watch for them in other areas as well. In fact, university newspapers are printing a lot more of the notices of funerals for students that are, they're in their 20s and they're not dying in automobile accidents or motorcycle accidents. They're just dropping over of things you normally think of people dying of in their 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
That's entropy.
Okay, so number 1.
Okay, what we're looking at is the effects of the radiation on metal. So what you look at are critical points. Now, one of the real big ones that you brought up, that was where oil pressure failures are occurring. And that's a pressurized system. That brings a number of other criticalities. You've got finer pieces of metal that are being bent into place in order to crimp some type of a hose closed. Those are very fine. There's a lot of stress on them. There are a lot of areas that are particular candidates for failure in those systems unless you overbuild them to mil spec. And that's done with metal-to-metal joins everywhere. So that's what the airline industry is going to have to do, because crimping hydraulics in any other fashion at this point is futile. What you're doing is you are creating a Rube Goldberg machine it will break spectacularly and before you expect it.
We have quite a bit of research from the IAEA outlining the types of radiation embrittlement that happens in nuclear reactors, in the reactor buildings, in any of the 10,000 parts in those reactor buildings. Now, they state right from the IAEA's own PDF on the subject, there are two types of embrittlement which do affect power water reactor vessel internal components. This is irradiation embrittlement, which may affect core region internals, and thermal aging embrittlement, which may affect the cast stainless steel parts and parts manufactured from stainless steel. Fatigue, corrosion, and then we have also radiation-induced creep, relaxation, and swelling. Neutron irradiation creates a large number of interstitials and vacancies that can annihilate on sinks such as dislocations, grain boundaries, surfaces, etc. by a diffusion-controlled process. The kinetics of this annihilation are different for interstitials and vacancies and depend on stress, temperature, material microstructure, etc. If interstitials are eliminated rapidly, the excess vacancies coalesce into voids or bubbles inside of the metal, which lead to swelling of the structure. Now, this is why they have to replace reactor shrouds every so often, because the steel becomes so brittle. Now, we're used to different types of steel being used in infrastructure, and aluminum and cadmium and nickel being used in airline skins. But these are all affected in similar ways. And Leuren, you and I were talking just before we started taping tonight about some research that you came across from Oak Ridge Labs.
Yes. The way this discovery of the Wigner effect occurred, of course, I've been working with you on airplane emergency landings and problems with batteries and things like that. And I had no idea. I didn't know about the Wigner effect. I've never heard of it. But I began looking for information, and I came across a paper published in about the 1970s by Oak Ridge National Lab. And it was a paper on historic earlier events and departments and discoveries at Oak Ridge in the 1950s. And it was called Clinton Labs at that time, and it was managed by Monsanto for the U.S. government. Now, Dr. Wigner was an immigrant from Austria, I believe. I think he came from Vienna, but I think he was actually German. And he came over to the United States before the U.S. even joined World War II. And he was immediately made a Manhattan Project scientist. So he was working on the creation of the nuclear bombs during World War II, and also on depleted uranium was also proposed as a radioactive poison gas weapon under the Manhattan Project. I don't know exactly what research he did, but when World War II was over and the Manhattan Project ended, some of those scientists became JASON scientists, which are civilian scientists for the Pentagon, and they just rebranded the Manhattan Project scientists under a new contract, and they were called JASON scientists. Now, when World War II was over, the U.S. government and probably international entities, I'm sure they were, wanted to develop nuclear power. And of course, that was Eisenhower's program, Atoms for Peace. Now, Dr. Wigner was sent to the Clinton Laboratory, which is now the Oak Ridge Laboratory, and he did extremely basic research. He was a mathematician, and all science starts with mathematics. It ends up on the desk of engineers because they make it work. They produce the final package. And Dr. Wigner was doing research on the effect of radioactive bombardment of metals in doing basic research to produce metals and understand what the effects of radiation would be on metals used in nuclear reactors. And so he was doing that early research on the effect of alpha particles, beta particles, gamma rays, and X-rays that are all ejected from the nucleus of radioactive materials, and they bombard anything that is around them. Now, there are almost 2,000 radionuclides that are produced in a fission process, such as Fukushima. So when the media or sort of lay people, whatever governments that are trying to deceive people, they will talk about basically cesium, strontium-90, radioactive iodine, and they forget to tell people that there are almost 2,000 radionuclides that are being bombarded by. And radiation has a cumulative effect. So when these energy rays and particles are bombarding metal, they create a flow of electrons on the surface of the metal, and these electrons steal electrons from the matrix of the metal, the atomic matrix of the metal, and they begin causing defects in the metal. Those are the interstices. And in ancient times, the Japanese and for the samurai swords, and in Damascus was very famous for very fine steel during the Crusades and even earlier ancient times.
Okay. It was when you were doing samurai swords in Damascus, steel was a little.
So in ancient times, the Japanese and also the steel makers in Damascus, the sword makers in Damascus, knew that if they heated steel and they pounded it, and they heated it and pounded it, and they heated it and pounded it, it made it stronger and stronger and stronger and more flexible each time. So the Japanese samurai sword makers and the Damascus sword makers in the Middle East were the centers of the discovery of annealing metals. And so what that heating and pounding does is it drives all of the defects in the steel out of the steel and makes it stronger and more flexible.
It aligns the crystals and it adds the carbon, which in addition to tempering brings you your hardness.
Yes. So Dr. Wigner reported that, and he also reported that bombardment by nuclear energy would cause, just a minute, I'm blanking for a minute, would release, it would create hydrogen, which builds up, and that's exactly what happened, and it's released by the surface of the metal, and that's exactly what happened that caused the first explosions at Fukushima. The fissioning started, it ran away because the cooling systems were shut down by the earthquake, and 15 minutes after the earthquake, those reactors were already in meltdown. And by 7 p.m. that night on the, what was the date of the?
The 11th, was it?
Yes, 3/11. On March the 11th, by 7 p.m., all the reactors had completely melted down and also melted through the wall of the reactor outer shell.
Making what are known as
Yes.
elephant feet on their way down to the earth.
Right.
Right through the cement and making it. Right there. That's
Yes.
where it starts.
It dripped, it burned right through the floor of the floor that the reactor was sitting on, and it dripped down into the basement, and then it burned right through the floorboard of the reactor building into the ground. And as it drips, it accumulates, and it becomes a bigger and bigger collection of the radioactive fuel. The fuel pellets in the reactor actually melt, and as time goes on, it is burning down deeper and deeper into the ground, and 3 years later, that reactor material is at least 80 feet down on the ground, and it's flowing into the ocean.
It's contaminating the water table. It is contaminating the Fukushima Bay. It is creating brim strawing in the steam it is making over the Fukushima Bay.
That's right.
This is a real mess. And getting back to entropy for a second, when you're in the presence of that concentration of radionuclides, the rate of acceleration on entropy becomes staggering. In point of fact, putting a nuclear reaction of any variety inside of a container and pretending that you're holding it, it's not a truth. What it is you have a measured piece of fuse. And the question becomes, how long did you measure your fuse?
And so what we're talking about today is the amount of radiation that's been released into the atmosphere, into the ground, into the ocean. The Pacific Ocean has now circulated and mixed in the environment, in the biosphere, the atmosphere, for 3 years. And what we're seeing is an acceleration and an increase, almost exponential, of the Wigner effects on airlines and airplanes, the crews, the passengers, and the entire air column from the ground up to space is all contaminated with the Fukushima radiation. And that's what we're covering today. What is happening to the airplanes?
Well, just as far as number one goes, the indicators that we have from just basic knowledge about metallurgy, as outlined by Dr. Wigner, we have the environmental science and technology reports from the IAEA about metal degradation as outlined in that heavy component replacement in nuclear power plants, which was published most recently in 2008. We know that rad exposure will cause this embrittlement and create hydrogen in the metal matrix. And then we observed some of this happening over the course of the Fukushima accident too, and many researchers have voiced their concern about the fuel pools, about the integrity of everything at the site because of this constant bombardment. So it's something with time will get worse, much like all the other things that we've talked about in the last 3.5 years. You know, the mutations, sickness, accumulation in different organisms, and the effects of that. This is all happening very fast.
Yes,
Christina, it actually has escalated to the next level. And we have to bring it back around to entropy one more time to explain this one. because now what we have is a compromised reactor vessel. The fuse on Fukushima ran out, and they lit it off because they had themselves an earthquake. That earthquake was engineered, so this fuse was actually accelerated by the Navy. Now what you have is this accelerated fuse has compromised your containment vessels, and your containment vessels have leaked. That leak is out, that leak is down into the groundwater. Now what is occurring here is that you've got this in a water base, and you've got yourself a large brimstrawing, and you have got yourself a pile that is inclusive of two different very unstable basic radionuclides. These are your uraniums and your plutoniums, and the differentiation in the temperatures and things between those creates neutron pulse, which is the up of the ante on this particular problem.
And what the neutron pulse is, it's a neutron bomb. It's a neutron pulse weapon. And that those neutrons can travel 250 miles. When I was investigating Fukushima and the damage to other reactors and other plants, I discovered that Fukushima was one of 4 plants that had released large amounts of radiation or had other kinds of damage. The damage was caused by the earthquake, not the tsunami. And the damage was to the fuel pools. The reason that the reactors melted and the fuel pools where the spent fuel was stored, those caught on fire, releasing huge volumes of radioactive smoke with those 2,000 radionuclides that I was talking about. And those have traveled all over the world, and as time goes on, those levels will increase, the damage will increase, and the entire infrastructure of this planet is now in a process of decay and disintegration, everything. And that includes the biosphere, all living things as well. It's the dance of entropy. It's universal. Entropy is the universe. So we are in an accelerated state of our entire world disintegrating, and the effects are very, very, very serious, and they will be more and more apparent as time goes on. Bridges collapsing, buildings falling down. It's very serious, and the reason we're doing this interview is to inform people and warn people and educate people so that they can do their own research, they can take measures they need to take. Flying is something people need to consider very carefully before they get into an airplane now. And there are crew members and pilots who are dropping dead like flies. So that's also an issue. I think we all recommend that people not fly unless they absolutely have to.